Hi everyone, this is Sean Ismail from Cloud Ranger, and you are viewing the Microsoft Azure training. Today is the part 6 of Azure websites, and we are going to continue with something called scaling. So the topic is about Azure websites scaling. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to talk about scaling or scalability is what is elasticity. It's a term that's very prominent in any cloud paradigm. Doesn't matter who the vendor is, Azure or whoever else is. And what elasticity is, it's more of a characteristics of the cloud itself. And that differentiates cloud from the other computing paradigms like distributed computing or grid computing or anything like that. What elasticity basically means is that it's defined as that it is how your system is going to adapt with its capacity when the workload changes over time. So what that means is that today, if you have a website and there are 50 users that you come that comes to your website averagely in an hour, how does the underlying system, uh, sort of changes or responds to if that user base increases over time? So if you have 50 users at 8 a.m. in the morning, how will your system respond to resources? If you have about 1,000 users coming in at like 10 a.m. in the morning. So the capacity is here as the dimension. So how the capacity of the underlying resources adapts or changes with respect to the workload. Here in our example, the workload was more of the users. This is particularly important in Azure websites because if you recall, and we will go through this during the demonstration, is that you have separate plans, and each plans for your websites have certain number of cores, certain number of CPUs, certain amount of RAMs, hard drives, and things like that. So one of this one of this is called an instance. So what happens is that every time you build a website, your instance for that website will be built on that kind of resources, whichever you choose. So if you have free or shared or standard premium, so those plans actually turn out to be each instance's resources. Now, with elasticity, what we are trying to say is that how are these resources, affected or adapted when the workload changes? And here, the workload will be based on number of users that come in or your application and so forth. So it will probably make more sense once we get into the demonstration, but let's get into the concepts here a little bit more. So with elasticity, when we said that there is going to be this adaptability of resources, this is scaling, right? I mean, you're increasing resources, decreasing resources with response to how the workload is, so you're changing capacity. So there are various scaling techniques, and these techniques are not only just for cloud, but everything else. So the one we are most used to are scaling up and down, and there is also scaling out and scaling in. So let's explain scaling up and down. What does it mean? So what happens is, so when we started virtualization, we got off from the physical paradigm to virtual infrastructure, the paradigm of virtualization. Scaling up and down was the most important selling factor. So you have a virtual machine, which has like 4 core of CPUs, 12 gigs of RAM, and like 80 gigs of hard drive. So you find out a month later that your application actually requires more resources because you are creating web application there or you're creating a database there, which requires more resources. So what you do ideally is increase the resources. And the way you do that in physical world would be open up your server, go ahead and put in, a bunch of more RAM sticks in there. So from 12 gigs, you'd make it 16 gig or 24 gig, something like that. In virtualization, scaling up and down became more easier. So what we did was literally go in there and from a pool of resources of RAM, we just take the slider to the right or just put in and say that, hey, rather than having 12 gigs of memory, start putting 24 in there. So your virtual machine or the server itself would be a constant here, or it will be always there. All you are doing is adding or removing resources. Okay, so this is what scale up and down was when your machine stayed the way it is and you just kept adding and removing resources. With the cloud paradigms in general, the scaling out and in came in place. So what scaling out and in is, and this is the primary difference between scaling out and in versus scaling up and down, is that they said that if you have a server with 4 cores and 12 gigs of memory and 80 gigs of hard drive, if you need more resources, do not add any resources to those servers. In fact, what you can do is, why don't you add one entirely new server? So you have, instead of one server with 4 cores, 12 gigs of RAM, and 80 gigs of hard drive, you'll have two servers, and even that server will also have now, 4 cores, 12 gigs of memory, and 80 gigs of hard drive. So you have two servers, and you can combine those resources. Do not worry for now how they will combine the resources, but they're saying that instead of having one server, two servers will be more beneficial. Okay, so that's what scaling out and in is, that you don't add resources by adding to the standard or the server or the system you're working with, rather than you add one more server itself. Now here, the first server is sort of called the first instance, and with the second server adding, you can say you are adding one more instance to the server rather than, the terminology being that you are adding one more server. You're saying that I'm adding, so I have two instances now. So what do you find out? That over the weekends, it's a retail site, for example, and over the weekends, a lot more people Friday night or Saturday morning come to the site, and you find out that the way your web application is, your one server, or in our case now one instance, is not enough. People are having slow response from the website, the shopping cart, whatever. So you say, I'm going to add one more instance. So you add one more server in the pool there with the resources. Eventually, when your retail site becomes more popular, you find out that two of them is not going to be enough. So you go ahead and another instance, and you can keep adding more and more and more instance as you go. So this is what scaling in and out is, and this is very prominent in Azure Cloud, and this is what makes cloud really the cloud, with saying that you have unlimited amount of resources. So the reason behind scaling out and in, there are different school of thoughts which come and tell the why they are more advantageous and why they're not, the pros and cons and all that stuff. But what Microsoft, or in general most cloud vendors, have said, that scaling out and in is so much more easier, because now you don't have to take the primary server down, add more resources. Adding and removing more resources is more complicated because the server might have limitations, saying that, hey, you cannot add more than 256 gigs of memory at one point. The motherboard itself, those physical limitations we used to have, that, hey, you can only put so many cores of CPUs in there, you can put so much RAM and hard drive in there. After that, there are just physical limitations. So, the cloud vendors have said that scaling out and in is easier. We can add as many servers we want, or as many instances we want, because there are no limitations for each of them separately. Okay, so that's why scaling out and is so important. Now, we want to get into what auto scaling is. So you remember how I said that on the weekend you find out that in the morning there are more users, so you add more servers, remove more servers, or add more instances? Well, you want to do this pretty much on auto. So you don't want to wake up and be like, I don't know what's going on with the CPUs right now. Let me go and see all the CPUs of my 5 instances. You go to all 5 and be like, looks like people are getting a slow response, so I'm going to spin up another couple of more instances. No. So what it is saying is that you want to do this automatically. So, there is going to be certain metrics, certain parameters, certain thresholds that should match, and auto scaling will scale up and down. I mean, sorry, not up and down, scale out and in based on those parameters. So auto scaling in Azure does that similarly, okay? So it has different parameters. So it will go look on either metrics saying that, hey, your CPU is so and so, so I'm going to add one more instance, or your RAM has gone up so much and it's consistent, so I'm going to go add more instance. Or you can do based on schedule. You can go and say that, hey, on the weekdays, I want you to run 3 instances of this website, but on weekends, I'm going to go add 2 more and make it 5, because that's where most of my users come in. So that's how auto scaling in Azure happens. So let's look at this in a little bit deeper, okay? So auto scaling methods that are the way they're used in Azure, looks like I have a little bit typo here. Let me fix that. It's bothering. That's better. So autoscaling methods used in Azure websites. So like I mentioned, there is using metric. So you have CPU, RAM, and other resources, right? So the metric with the metric, the way it will work is that, hey, if your CPU is about 60% and more for the last 5 minutes, go spin another instance. Or similar with RAM and other stuff. And like I mentioned, using schedules, day and night, weekends, weekdays, and this is how it is. Now, you have obviously some limitations of instances, okay? So you cannot just go and say, I want to add 1,000 instances in there. You might have a requirement too, and there are ways to do that, but there are limitations as well. So cannot scale to zero, the point that I have up on the slide over here, this actually means is that you cannot have the instance always has to be between 1 to something, okay, like 1 to 10. You cannot have any, you cannot scale between like 0 to 10 because 0 would mean that your website is not up and running. So with this scaling, and this is important for your exam as well as your production, is that when you scale, you cannot turn off the website. So you cannot say, okay, during the weeknights at this time to this time, I don't want the website to be running, so scale it down to 0. You cannot do that. You always have to have one instance. So 1 to 10, for example, you have to be anything in between, and you have to choose that. The other thing you have to remember is that you have to always choose an instance size. So if you are on a standard one, so S1 instance, there are certain resources standard web plans have. All the other instances will have to be standard one. So the very first instance is the one that will be spawned to the rest 9 of them, for example. So you cannot have a standard app plan instance and have the other one, for example, go up to the premium one, because that would be more like scaling up. So from standard to premium is actually scaling up. That's not really scaling out. So you cannot scale up when you are doing scaling with instances. So that 1 to 10 of that instances, they all have to be the same size. So the original size. Having said that, there it will be a time when you will have to determine that, hey, rather than having 10 instances running for a standard one, what if I had like 3 premiums running? Maybe it will be easier. Okay, so there is a math that you'll have to eventually do to find out based on how your website is. And that's not too common. You do that once you see how the or the user patterns are, and eventually take it from there. Okay, so I don't want to spend so much time right now on the slides. Let's go to our Azure subscription and start playing with this and see how everything works. Okay. So right now I am in my subscription. Let's go to browse everything. Technically, there shouldn't be anything in there. Perfect. So by now you should know um, how to add sites and do all of that. But I'm going to just go ahead and do one with you in case you want to follow along and want to make everything the same. So I'm going to go create a web app. Let's go call it Ranger Website 100. Looks like it's available. So let's create an app service plan. So we'll call it Ranger Plan. It's there. So the pricing tier is S1 standard. Let me come back to this. Let's keep it here for now. You need a resource group, so we'll call it Ranger East 2 resource group. And I want to make my location East 2. That's where the resource group is anyways, pinned to start, but I don't want to get pinned. So let's go ahead and look at the pricing tier to actually look at the resources. And we'll expand this. And over here, as you can see, it's just taking the recommended ones, but I want to view all. Okay, let's maximize this so we can see this better. So obviously, if you come down to something like the free one, you can see in the free shared infrastructure, there's not much, I mean, there's no instances. You can't do the scaling in your free. In fact, you cannot even do it in D1, which is shared. You cannot do any scaling. However, when you come to the basic plans, you can see up to 3 instances, and it is manual scale. Okay, so all the basic plans will give you up to 3 instances to scale, and it's manual. And you have to basically, what it means by manual is that you have to come in and scale it in and out by yourself. The auto scaling that we were talking about based on metric and schedules do not qualify for the basic plans. Okay. Now let's go to our standard plans, the standard 1, 2, and 3. You can see you can go up to 10 instances here, okay? And with the 10 instances here, they all are auto scale. So what this means is that from 1 to 10, you can add as many instances as you want, and they will auto scale for you. And similarly, in premium, you can see it goes to 20 instances, and they're subject to availability. Means sometimes since premium servers are much more harder to come by in different regions or locations, there is some subject to availability there. So sometimes you might not have it. So let's talk about the resources. So we know the shared infrastructure, we don't know how they are, what kind of resources they have because these are shared. Okay. With the basic one, as you can see, there is basic one core, 1.75 gigs of RAM and 10 gigs of resources. So if you want to add the first instance, when you first create this, you'll have one core, 175 gigs of RAM and 10 gigs of storage. This one is manual scale. So when you add one more instance, basically you are going and saying that I need one more core and 1.75 gigs of RAM and 10 gigs of resources. So you're not making this one core to two cores. You're adding one entire instance of basic one, which means that everything will double. The next time you put 3 instances, it will actually triple. So it's not one server. Let's think of this every time you're adding an instance, it's becoming another server. Okay, that's how we want to look at it. So you can have up to 3 instances and you'll have up to 3 cores total, for example. And what will happen is that at one point you'll be like, even 3 instances of basic is not working for me. So what you can't do is that you can't have 1 or 2 instances of basic 1 and the third instance make it basic 2. You can't do that. Your instances are always going to be the same app plan. At one point, if you see that even adding 3 instances of this plan is not working, you probably want to move everything to basic 2. So each instance will now have 2 cores, 3 gigs of RAM. So now up to 3 of this means you'll be able to go to up to 6 cores rather than 3 cores total when you do that. So you can't do a mix match up app plans when you do the instances. You have to remember this for your exam and in production as well, that you always want to make sure is the same app plan that's converted to instance. So in our case, we are choosing S1 standard. So I know I'm going to start off with 1 core, 1.7 gigs of RAM, and 50 gigs of storage. Okay, so the next time I have one more instance, it will still be standard 1 and it will be the other one. Okay, so let's choose that, and we are going to standard 1 for our pricing tier. So absolutely, we know there can be instances that can be created there. We are not using the free one or the free or the shared one. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this website. So I'm going to pause and come back when this is created. Okay, looks like our website is made. Let's go browse everything. Go view our website, Ranger website 100. And yep, everything looks okay. So the thing that we want to look at here for scaling is, let's scroll down here, Where did it go? Pricing tier, scale. Okay, this is the one we want. So we can see the auto scale is on, and by default, when you first create a website, there's only one instance. Okay, let's go ahead and click on that to see what options we get. So by default, you can see there's one instance that's up and running, and there is a lot of scale by options here, and we are going to go, work with all of this. Give me a moment here. Let's go expand that. So the way with the new, and you know what, this might change by the time you're viewing this video. Right now, this is how it is. They're actively working on making this a scaling. I mean, get everything from the management portal to the preview portal, but don't forget this is a preview portal, so a lot of things over here might change by the time you watch this video. But I'm hoping that it's going to stay relevant. The concepts are still going to be the same. Okay. So the first one we want to see is scale by an instance count that I enter manually. Okay, so you can manually change your instance. So rather than one instance, you can go like 2, 3, and you can see you can manually pretty much scale the way you want it. If you save it, you'll have that many instances up and running. So that's as easy as changing that. In fact, let's do one of this. So let's go change 2. Let's go save. Let this happen. Okay, successful. Let's come over here. Successfully saved scale setting. Let's minimize this one, go over here and see how many instances we have. So now you can see the instances change to 2. Okay, so you now have 2 standard 1 from the pricing. We know that we are on a standard 1, right? So we are running the one small instance of S1. So we have 2 of this running right now, S1, S1. Okay, so that was how you do this manually. It's as simple as that. And then you can go, like I mentioned, there's a metric that you can go by. So you can go by CPU percent. So what you can say here is, we'll go through this one actually. You can say that, hey, if you have the CPU up and running more than 60%, 60% to, for example, 80%, I want the instance to be brought to, like, I don't know, 4. Okay. So what you're basically saying is that sample the CPU. And once you sample the CPU, and I think by default it's like an average, so it will go through an average of few minutes to actually see if your CPU is within 60 to 80%. And if it is, it will be like, okay, I think the server is taking, or the instance is taking a hit. So, we need to increase and scale out to another, I mean, 3 more instances if you are running on one instance. So it will add 3 more instances. And I want to be careful when I say this over here is that do not worry about doing something like this. Some of you might be thinking that, hey, there might be an application which is running and it just spiked up to 60 to 80. And what will happen? I mean, are we going to get, thrashed with these resources or the scaling in and out? Because it will be like, hey, you know what? It hit 60. Let's go spin up instance. No, it does not happen that way. Even if this is auto, what Azure does in the back end is that for a specific amount of time, I think it's 5 minutes, it will actually sample your instance and see if it is like that. So technically a spike of CPU, which means that it will just go up to 60, stay there for a couple of seconds and come down. That's what a spike is all about. This will not respond to spikes. It will say that, hey, I want you to be 60 to 80 for at least 2 or 5 minutes, for example. And if you are consistently more than that in that time frame, I know that you are having a hard time, so I'm going to add an instance to it. Okay? And this is how Azure ensures that your resources are not getting thrashed every time CPU goes up and down. Okay? But this is as simple as that. There are other metrics in there that you can measure, and I'll show you how to do that. But let's go to the default options they have right now. So the last one we want to do is schedule and performance rules. With schedule and performance rules, you can actually do more. So by default, you remember we did scale 1 to 2. So that's the default one we have. So you always have a default, and the default scale always applies. Okay, this is the one that's there. The current one, the default scale that we have, it basically says that if your CPU is at least equal to 80%, increase the count by 1, okay? Because we have a total of 2 instances, so we can only go up by 1 more. And we are saying that, hey, if the CPU percent drops below 60%, you can decrease the count by 1 as well. This decrease count by 1, by 2, this all can be changed, okay? So I want to show you how to add up or chain more rules in here based on this. So if we want to do a little bit more, so you do add rules, and this is scale by schedule and performance. Okay, this takes care of the CPU percentage here as well. So let's go ahead, add a rule. In add a rule, you can see that you are going through a resource, and the resource is your current plan. Now you're going to choose your metric. Over here, they did not let us choose our metric. There was one CPU, but let's choose a metric. So we can see that there are built-in few metrics here. CPU percentage, memory, disk queue length, HTTP queue length. This is very interesting for a website. So you want to make sure how many requests you get and how many of those are queued in, and data in and out. So the one we are interested in is in CPU. We are going to say greater than, so this was equal to or less than. And we are going to say your threshold is of 5 and the duration is 20 minutes. So by default, we had 20 minutes. So if this was equal to 80% of CPU utilization for 20 minutes, it would increase by 1. So what I'm going to say is that don't worry about 20 minutes. For 10 minutes, if you are going to have do that average aggregation and you increase the count by 2, the threshold obviously was like I wanted to change that actually to 90. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that if your CPU is greater than 90 for an average of 10 minutes, means for last 10 minutes it has stayed greater than 90, 92 or 93% of it, increase the count of your instances by 2. Okay, increase the count by 2 means if you have one instance and this is the criteria that matches, I want you to become 3 instances. Okay, and cooldown in minutes is means that if how long you want to wait for this to revert back before you actually start taking the instances off. So you want to make sure that once again that your resources are not getting thrashed. Okay, you want to wait every 5 minutes before you do this, and that's all we need. Let's click on OK. And let's see what happens. Okay, so we had a new rule that was created over here where we said that if you have the CPU percent more than greater than 90 for 10 minutes, increase the count by 2. So you can actually have a various different combination of scales that you can actually put in here. Okay, you can do manual, you can do auto. So this thing, it's hard to simulate that, but if you actually had some way of simulating the CPU for these websites or the underlying systems or instances hit more than 90, you would actually see automatically these instances going up, okay, and the average of 10 minutes. The other thing I want to show over here is, let's go add a rule. There are other resources here, as you can see, but the one that we chose here was, sorry, the one that we chose here was the one based on the plans. Okay, so your resources are coming from the plan you're on. So our plan is a standard 1. So it wants to make sure that you are on the same plan when you are doing this. Okay, so let's show you one more thing. So you see over here that this is the default scale. Okay, when I click on this default scale, the default is always, which means that this is the default scaling for your websites right now. This is the default one. This will happen always, regardless of what time of the day it is, weekday or weeknight, seasonal or whatever. It will happen always. But there is a way to actually change that. So for example, I do not care if these metrics are actually changed on the weekdays. Okay, so I can always go and say recurrence, and this is when we actually go to the scheduling, and we say that we want to do this only on the weekends. Okay, so we are going to only have this on Saturday and Sunday. So whatever the characteristics or the parameters I have over here for my CPU, I only care about them on Saturdays and Sundays. I do not care about them when they're on a weekday. So the way you do that is you'd go under recurrence, and recurrence bits because it will happen every weekend, and there are 2 days selected, and I selected weekends. It actually shows you the time. So I'm on Eastern time, so I want to do this on let's see, where is my Eastern time? US and Canada. So yeah, I'm in Eastern time. You'll be obviously changing this to your time. And I'm saying that 12 o'clock midnight on Saturday morning, I want you to start hitting these rules. So now, not only I have the CPU metrics that I'm observing, I'm also telling it that I only care about this on the weekends. Okay, so you can actually have days and times, days and nights, and all that. You can do that way. So let's think of this way. If you are having a retail website and you know that on 25th, People are all busy with Christmas on 25th December. But in Canada, we have something called as Boxing Day. I know it's a funny name, but Boxing Day is something like a sale that happens the day after Christmas. So it's on the 26th of December. So Boxing Day is a very important day for retailers, and they know that a lot of people are going to go to the retail site. They're going to show up in the shops. Maybe they'll just go to the retail site to check what time the store is open and down. So you know that you have a lot of resources that are required for a system only on the 26th of December. So the way you do that is actually go to a fixed date. And in fixed date, you basically go over here and select your day and time. So you go something like December 2015, for example, and I want to go and say, hey, start this from actually 25th, and keep going all the way to December, I don't know, 28th, because let's assume the entire load will, it will be all okay. So you can actually have these all systems go through this matrix and change instances based on a fixed date. So you can have always, you can have recurrent, or you can have fixed date when it comes to schedule. And this schedule will actually look at the performance, where the performance is here. In our case, it's CPU. Maybe you do not want your users to even, your instances to spin up in 10 minutes. Okay. Remember how we wanted to wait for 10 minutes for this to go up to 90%? I mean, stay in not more than 90% for 10 minutes. Maybe it's too much because on that day, it's a very important day. You don't want your users to be frustrated. So you can make it 1 minute that, hey, if my CPU is more than 90% of utilization for a minute, I want you to spin something like 3 more instances right away because today is a very important day for my business. So you can do something like that, okay? The last thing is I want to show over here is that I want to leave default the way it is because I don't want to make any changes with default. You can have more settings over here by adding a new profile. So this was the default profile. You could actually have more profiles. So I can say my Christmas profile. So my Christmas over here, this will be my fixed date. And I will say, my target range is like 1 to 10 or whatever. So let's go, I don't know, 6 to 10. I'll go change my date. Let's see. I'll come to December, go to 25th, come over here, go to December, make it, I don't know, 28th. And let's go over here, my Christmas scale. Let's call it Christmas scale. Click OK. Okay, so that way you can actually see that I created a new scale over here. I'm not using the default one, and I'm going to add rules to this profile now. Okay, so my profile over here, let's keep something simple. I want my CPU percent, if it is greater than, well, more than 75% for a duration of 5 minutes. Do an average aggregation. There's minimum and maximum as well, but average is the best one I feel, because let's aggregate or sample this data and make an average. And I'll tell you a little bit more details on this, and I'll say the increase by count by 2 and cooldown time of 5 minutes and go. Okay. So what I'm going to have is that on my Christmas schedule, I want to say if my CPU percent or my performance is like this, increase count by 2. So you can have your websites have multiple profiles for scaling. And again, each scale will have a schedule which is always by default. The default one is always, or you can have based on recurrent day and night, or weekends and weekdays, or specific dates. In our case, which was specific over here. The thing that I wanted to show you over here, very important for your exam as well as production, is that this aggregation, okay? This time aggregation is average. So let's start from the scratch. If we have one instance that is more than 75% of CPU for, for 5 minutes average, I want 1 more or 2 more instances to be added, okay? So now we have 3 instances. What happens if the CPU again goes more than 75? When I say if the CPU more than 75, the average here will actually mean that you want the CPU to be more than 75 on all 3 instances right now. If one of the instances is more than 75, it doesn't matter because, it already triggered two more the last time. Now you have three instances, right? Out of these three instances, if one of them have more than 75% of CPU, it doesn't matter. Nothing is going to happen because Azure will know that, hey, even if your one instance is getting hammered, you have two other instances that can take the load. But the only way you'd actually trigger two more instances if you have an average of more than 75% of CPU, like for 5 minutes on all three instances. So you have instance 1, 2, and 3. They have CPU percent of more than 75 on instance 1, instance 2, and instance 3 for the last 5 minutes. This is when Azure knows that, okay, all the instances are now getting hammered more than 75% based on this guy's rule. I'm going to add two more. So now you'll have five instances. With five instances, again, the cycle continues because it will say that, hey, let all five be above 75 before I add up more. Okay. And then it will cool down every time. Now every time you have increased it, it will just slow down for 5 minutes. It does not go right away and do whatever it has to do for the next series of stepping up or scaling out. It'll be like, let's wait for 5 minutes before we actually do everything else. So you have to remember that for your examiner and all that as well, that this time aggregation is like for an average of 5 minutes on all instances before increasing or decreasing can be done. Okay. Now if you keep increasing, you will hit at one point all 10 and it will stay all 10 even if it goes below 75. Okay, so you want to have a rule something like this, that hey, you know what, now if it now goes less than 60 for the last 5 minutes on all my instances, start taking them down one by one. Okay, so when you are doing the cool down here at this point, it will not go for 10 instances and bring it down all the way to 1. It will cool down for 5 minutes. So from 10 instances, it will become 9. Then it will cool down for 5. It will check that again for another 5 minutes that, if anything happened or not in the last 5 minutes. And it will say that, hey, looks like it is still below 60% here for the last 5 minutes. So let's bring one. So this cooldown happens after each instance is created or removed. So when you are doing that increase count by two, the two of them will not be like bam, 3 to 5. It'll be 3, then it'll wait for 5 minutes, and it'll go 4. It'll wait for 5 minutes, it'll go 5. So there is a step up or a cool down period. Once again, Azure puts all of that in there so you don't get like really, really thrashed with the resources up and down. It takes time. Now, the thing you have to remember with this is that this time needs to be calculated very, very well, depending on your business, how it is. Because for some businesses, for example, if you're doing e-commerce and someone is adding something to the shopping cart, and in the shopping cart now they're checking out, they probably do not have time for the CPU percentage to go more than 90 and wait 5 minutes for this to happen. So you want to make sure there are always available resources in there, even if they're hitting the maximum, okay? Because if it is more than 90%, for example, and you are in a shopping cart and you're checking out and it's connecting to your merchant services and trying to charge that credit card or the PayPal account, whatever, it might actually time out because for whatever reason, it will say, I don't have enough resources to make this, and a lot of mess might happen. So this might be something really extreme. You probably want to start acting by the time it's 50%. So if your CPU is 50% on 3 different instances for 5 minutes, chances are you are going to have a problem or you already have a problem. So you want to probably start working on that proactively before it actually hits 90%. Okay. So in production, there is a bunch of calculation that you actually need to do over here. And this entire thing with this up and down. So okay, so it will sample for 5 minutes. Then after that, every two instances. So after sampling for 5 minutes, it will wait for cooldown of 5 minutes. So there you go, 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, it will wait for another 5 minutes of sampling, so 15 minutes. And then it will go increase another one. So between these two instances, after it hit 90%, just in our example here, if you followed me, it will take almost 15 minutes for each of these instances to spin up. And for certain businesses, that spinning up 15 minutes for when the CPU is already 90% is maybe not acceptable. Okay, so you want to start planning this out when you do the Azure websites properly. But that's all there is to scaling. And like I mentioned, this is auto scaling. So once you have done this, you don't have to do anything yourself. The system itself will look at the resources. System itself will do the sampling. It will do any scaling up and down for you. And this is the beauty of when it comes down to having your websites in Azure or any services in Azure, that it's elastic and it's an elastic scale, so you can go up and down, and it will add and remove resources for you depending on your demand. So, like I said, elasticity is actually defined as how your system adapts its capacity based on workload. Okay. So here, the adaptability is coming up and down based on the parameters or the thresholds that you have selected, and you are saying how it's going to scale or what kind of workload. And here, the workload is affecting directly the CPU, or CPU is the only one we are concerned with anyways at this point. So this is what elasticity does, and this is one of the main point of cloud, being in the cloud. And when you go to all this, all these seminars, webinars, or sales pitch when it comes to cloud, people just keep bringing elasticity in there. And this is a prime example of scalability and elasticity of cloud and the beauty of it to add and remove resources on its own. Okay, so let's go back to our slides real quick, because that's all that is there to it when it comes to scaling in and out, and as well as scaling up and down. So once you have, before we go to the slides, once you have found out that a lot has happened with your retail site in the last couple of years, you have more users, there might be a time you want to scale up. So you don't want to be on S1, you might want to go to S2, S3, or who knows, maybe you want to go to premium, because you'll find out that even after adding all those instances, you are adding and removing them way too much. You don't want to wait. You want already your CPU to have all the resources it wants. So you might want to go to a premium pricing tier and have all those resources and say that, hey, I don't want to do this scaling in and out so much because I figured out that I'm doing this way too often. That's probably one of the indicators that if your system is scaling up and down way too often, that you probably need to scale up right now and add more resources permanently so it doesn't go up and down, up and down, up and down, scaling in and out. Okay, so let's go back to our slide. And now this will start making sense that the auto scaling methods we had were using metrics. So you had metrics for CPU, RAM, and etc. Then you have schedules, which is day and night, weekdays, weekends, weekdays, as well as fixed time. And as you find out, we were scaling, well, at least in the standard tier, we were scaling from 1 to 10. It did not go to 0 at any point. Okay, there's no way to go to 0 and turn everything off, saying that, hey, I don't want my website. There are other ways to turn your website off if you don't want to do it, just not through scaling. Scaling is not what is required. I mean, it's used for. Okay. So that concludes our session. Our training site URL is at cloudranger.net/Azure-training. You are viewing YouTube at /CloudRanger Network. Twitter is at CloudRanger blog, and I'm on email at sean@cloudranger.net. And I hope that you have actually understood one of those clouds elasticity or the scaling point of view when it comes to the cloud. And it's been a big sales pitch for everybody who is selling Azure. So, we do this very often, and I wanted you to see firsthand how it is. So I hope you can follow along with this. You might have tools to actually do a load test on your website or do a stress test. So Visual Studio Ultimate has this very nice stress test tool where you can add load, and you can put in your URL and pretty much increase load to that. So maybe you might be able to create an application and do a load test and bring up your CPU or RAM or whatever metric you choose to put in there and see how it is. I think the easiest way to see this in action is put a fixed schedule. So if you're doing this today, go ahead and do an hour later or 30 minutes later, say that I want these instances to be increased to another 5. And then after 5 minutes, just go and see that, if the instances count went up. That's one easiest way to do that. But then again, whenever you build a enterprise grade website, you should do stress tests and you should actually see how this can be done. Most large organizations at one point or the other, let it be SharePoint, let it be your regular web application, they go through a stress test. And this stress test can be really, really, really complicated and done very complex way, because you want to just not go to the web page, right? You want to go to the web page. You want to simulate people browsing the site, going to the shopping cart or registration. So we do this for our clients with using Visual Studio Ultimate because it's very well done. But if you want, you can use other tools and you can see how these instances go up and down. Okay, so I think that's all for today, and I will see you in the next session. Thank you for viewing.